Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, still far from home. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Link is also in the description below. We have several different tiers, including a free one. Make sure you check it out. We put out a weekly newsletter in the free tier. Let's go ahead and jump in. So Ethereum is of course something that we have discussed throughout many years at this point, going all the way back to 2019 when we put out videos talking about how undervalued it was, not only on its USD pair but also on its Bitcoin pair. This was back when Ethereum was at $1 or $200. This is when the Ether Bitcoin valuation was less than 0.02, and now we still sit at around $1,600. And you might say, well, where is this not so far or not far from home coming from? Of course, if you followed the channel for a while, you'll know what I'm referring to. And it's this belief that I hold, of course, not that I necessarily a lot of people hold, but it's sort of this idea that Ethereum needs to revisit its lower logarithmic regression trend line before we are realistically, or before I would realistically start to think about a bull run to potentially new highs. So the idea is that Ethereum goes on these nice runs every once in a while, but it tends to touch base at home base in between these bull runs. And we have just been sitting outside of this level for a long time. It almost feels like, to some degree, it feels like Ethereum is just sort of, just teasing in one sense how it sits just outside of the lower regression trend line. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to as we talk about what is the fair value fit to quote unquote non-bubble data, and arguably it's this level right here. That is currently at 750. Okay, which you might say might cause you to raise an eyebrow and say, well, wait a second. That's lower than where we went in June. And I still am of the opinion that Ethereum could go lower than where it went back in June. One of the things I think to consider here, and we've talked about this before, is sort of your .com 2.0. We have a whole video series talking about what is the crypto bottom, where we talk about the total cryptocurrency market capitalization. But it might be useful to sort of hone in on Ethereum specifically to say, what is the .com bubble teach us, and what did people go through back then that we can potentially learn some lessons on today. And one of those things that I think you have to think about back during the .com crash is that it also corresponded to a recession. And I think this is, the biggest thing that is being discounted by a lot of people, is the idea that there will not be any sustained further move to the downside in risk assets, just simply because of a certain amount of time that's gone by. But I will remind you, there are plenty of assets, even in crypto, that can put in new lows even well after your primary bear market year. You think back to 2020, a lot of cryptocurrencies put in new lows. I don't believe Ethereum was one of them, but it actually did come pretty close, right? It was sort of like a double bottom, and maybe a slightly higher low, but Bitcoin's was a much higher low than Ethereum's. I mean, Ethereum almost double bottomed here. One thing that is somewhat of an eerie comparison, and I fully understand that this is dubious speculation at its best, and I'm not asking you guys to take this to the bank, but it is something that I came across, and so I thought it might be worthwhile to share. And it's actually the valuation of the NASDAQ compared to Ethereum. And while the market cap, of course, is different, in one case you're comparing an index, in the other case you're just comparing Ethereum. But I would also argue that Ethereum is sort of like the index for the altcoin market. It's the backbone of the altcoin market. If Ethereum didn't exist, it's hard to even imagine what the altcoin market would look like. And I know there are a lot of cryptocurrencies that sort of have branded themselves as the Ethereum killer, but I don't think that Ethereum is going to be relinquishing the number 2 spot anytime soon. But in the same way, I don't think Bitcoin's going to be relinquishing the number 1 spot anytime soon. We always talk about, or a lot of people talk about, spend a lot of time talking about, when is the flippening going to occur, this sort of stuff. But the reality of the situation is that Bitcoin's likely going to stay number 1, and Ethereum's likely going to stay number 2 for quite a long period of time. And while that might be a boring outlook, it is probably going to be the most likely outlook for at least several more years. Now, getting back to the dubious speculation that I mentioned. And again, I'm not asking you to take this to the bank. They're not going to cash it in, and I can assure you that I'm not going to cash it in either. But if you actually look at where Ethereum peaked here, it's interesting because it peaked right around 4,800, right? If you look at the high, it was around 4,867. What's interesting is the NASDAQ during the dot-com crash also peaked at the same level. And while it's a coincidence to some degree, it makes comparing them somewhat easier. If you look at the high on the NASDAQ back in the dot-com crash, so let me zoom in here. So if you look at the high here on the NASDAQ during the dot-com crash, if we just get the wick high here, 4816. So basically what you're looking at is Ethereum going to that 4,800 level and the NASDAQ going to the 4,800 level. What's more interesting is if you look at the 50-week moving average, and we talked a lot about this with regards to Bitcoin, but you can see that Ethereum is following a very similar path. Now, there have been some levels, some degrees of divergence, but one of the things you'll notice is that the NASDAQ peaked at 4,800. The rally that took us into the 50-week SMA, you might notice, started just below 1,100. So this was a rally that took the NASDAQ into the 50-week SMA that started at just below 1,100. Ethereum, this rally here that took us into the 50-week SMA, you can see also started just below 1,100. So in both cases, what you'll see is the NASDAQ dropping 77% before getting this rally into the 50-week SMA, right? We see that clear as day, dropping from around 4,800 down to this low here, just below 1,100. Now, Ethereum has played out somewhat differently. We know that Ethereum technically went lower back over here, but one of the things to measure here from this peak to this level here, again, also about a 77% move to the downside before you got that rally into the 50-week SMA. Furthermore, the 50-week SMA, when the NASDAQ was rejected, came in at just around 1,700. And what you'll notice during this rejection by the NASDAQ at 1,700, it didn't just go up once and get rejected. It sort of came up, we came back down, we had 2 red candles in a row, we then went back up and then got rejected. And this process was a more or less a distribution phase that took place over arguably, 4 to 6 weeks or so before really we had a rejection that I think was believed by more people off of the 50-week SMA, right? But it took about 4 to 6 weeks for that distribution phase on the NASDAQ to actually play out. And what's interesting, again, is when you look at Ethereum, you're seeing a very similar type of thing, right? It was a 77% move down to this low, at least, that took us into the 50-week SMA. And just like the NASDAQ, it was the 50-week SMA has been right around that 1,700 mark. You can see that Ethereum went right above 1,700 over here. And in fact, the high that the NASDAQ put in back over here was around 1,734, was the highest it went into that 50-week SMA. It more or less did a double top. Ethereum going into the 50-week SMA, the highest it's gone was 1,745. So again, I know that comparing like an index to a specific asset like Ethereum is not necessarily the most sound way to do it, but it does at least make for a very easy comparison between the tech stocks back then and Ethereum today. And I'm not saying they're the exact same thing, but there's no denying that at least so far they've played out in a very similar manner. Furthermore, what you may notice is that after Ethereum got rejected off of the 50-week moving average at around $1,700, it went down to around 1,300. Okay, so it went down to 1,300 and then went back up to that 1,500, about 1,550 or so, maybe a wick slightly higher, close to that 1,600 level. But again, from 1,300 up to about 1,550. What's interesting with Ethereum, again, and we can make these comparisons all day long, if you just sort of look at these trend lines that Ethereum has been following for quite some time. So if you just sort of look at the lower bound and the upper bound, these trend lines have basically been holding support and resistance ever since this bear market really got started. A series of lower highs, but also a series of higher lows. Now remember, the NASDAQ went down to around 13 1,300 before bouncing back up to 1,550. If Ethereum were to find a rejection here off the 50-week moving average and move back down to that 1,300 level or so, you're essentially looking at somewhere around this trend line, right? And then a bounce back up could correspond to what the NASDAQ did, right? Where it tried again, another go at the 50-week SMA, ultimately to just simply get rejected. And so I think you could argue that there's some validity to this comparison, especially given the macroeconomic conditions that we're facing, the fact that the Federal Reserve is remaining hawkish, and of course they're more or less compelled to stay that way because of the inflation that's still, you know, surprising to the upside. But if Ethereum were to come back in to this sort of 1,300 range, pop back up to, you know, 1,500 or so, this could easily play out in a very similar manner as the NASDAQ. Now, I suppose the question that is raised by all of this is, well, if Ethereum peaked at 4,800, which is where the NASDAQ peaked, right? The NASDAQ and Ethereum essentially both peaked at around 4,800. And so far, there have been a lot of comparisons to show that there are some similarities. There are some differences as well, one of them being that Ethereum put in a low over here, and this was a higher low, right? This was a higher low. The counterpoint, of course, the counterpoint to that is to say that it's different as well. Still, from the high going into this rally to the 50-week, both assets were down about 77% from this level to this rally. So Ethereum just capitulated a lot more during this initial sell-off. Okay, so where does that? What question does it raise, right? I mean, there's got to be a question that it raises, I'm sure, in everyone's mind as well. If they peaked at the same level at 4,800 and they had a rally to the 50-week that started at the same level, just below 1,100, and the rejection, potential rejection by Ethereum, we're not sure yet, but if the rejection occurred at around 1,700 off of the 50-week SMA, then what was the ultimate low for the NASDAQ, right? Where was the end of the bear market, and when could investors back then have finally said, all right, the bear market's over, and history would have shown that they were right? Well, go take a look at the NASDAQ. Where did it ultimately bottom? Its final low was around 795. Now, 795 is interesting in some sense because it is lower than where Ethereum already went. And I do actually think there is a good chance Ethereum will go lower than the June low. Okay, at the very least, I would say a double bottom, but I'd say it's more likely, in my opinion, that it'll actually go lower than this wick over here and go below the 880 level. So the NASDAQ bottomed at around 795. 795. Now think about that number for a minute. 795. It's about $100 lower than Ethereum already went. And that's not to say that Ethereum will find a bottom there. It could go lower, and we've talked about potential reasons that it could go lower. But one interesting thing to look at is to pull up our lower logarithmic regression trend line, fit to, again, quote unquote, non-bubble data. And when you do that, the fair value fit to non-bubble data is currently 782. That's where home is, right? I mean, you could argue that the second floor is all the way up at 1,100 and the basement's all the way down at 500, but home, more or less, is right around $782. So remember, when we first talked about this back over here, home was at like $600. Now it's closer, to that 782 level. And again, you could argue that, there's some leeway in both directions. But the reason why it's interesting is because if the NASDAQ were to give us any insight into Ethereum's ultimate low, 795 for Ethereum would be, let me just draw the trend line across. 75 would be somewhere around there, which is interesting because it's actually right around what the fair value is right now, corresponding to non-bubble data. Again, it's slightly higher because, as I said, the fair value of ETH based on this logarithmic regression trend line is actually at 782. So it's hasn't even reached that point. But we know that the logarithmic regression trend line, of course, is a monotonically increasing function. So it's only a matter of time before it would be at those levels. Now, in the same way, you can see that Ethereum can experience more room to the downside than the fair value. We've gone below the fair value before, so it could theoretically happen again. If you look back over here in 2016, you could say the fair value was $8, but we actually went down to $6. I mean, now it's essentially just 100 times that, right? Instead of 8 and 6, it's 800 and 600, right? If you look back over here, you can see that the fair value was at 51 cents, and we actually went down to 38 cents. You probably, those are some numbers that are probably somewhat hard to hear. Over here, we were at the fair value at 193. We still had a capitulation down to $89. So just because, that's where ultimately the fair value is, doesn't mean you can't go below it. And if you were to see some type of capitulation like this play out again, then you could overshoot the fair value to the downside, right? Rather than stopping it at 795 like the NASDAQ did, you could in fact go lower. I mean, just like Ethereum went lower in its initial plunge to this level, right? I mean, this level here was an 82% correction, right? This was an 82% correction, whereas the NASDAQ to that first main low before the rally to the 50-week, that first main correction for the NASDAQ was only about a 71% correction. And then the next one was a 77% correction. And the final one was an 83 to 84% correction. So if Ethereum is going to go down 83 to 84%, that puts it also around that fair value fit to, again, quote unquote, non-bubble data. So I would still argue that there, in my mind at least, again, I could be wrong. I've been wrong about, plenty of things. But in my mind, at least, there does seem like there is somewhat, some compelling evidence here to suggest that Ethereum is at the very least going to revisit those sub 1,000 levels at some point this year. And in my mind, likely going to go below where it was back in June of 2022. So that's my general opinion on it. The sort of the invalidation levels, I suppose, would be a deviation from the NASDAQ. And what would that look like? Well, I think you'd have to see Ethereum break above the 50-week SMA. But if Ethereum is unable to really break above the 50-week SMA in a sustained way, then how is this not just, your .com 2.0? And this is a video series we've been talking about for over a year now, where we've compared the .com bull to the crypto bull. We've compared the drawdowns in Bitcoin and the total market cap to what the NASDAQ did. And in this video, we're specifically comparing the NASDAQ to Ethereum. And I thought it was interesting that the actual levels more or less correspond to the same thing, right? Like the NASDAQ at 4,800, the rally to the 50-week started at around, just below 1,100 in both cases. And so that sort of leaves that final question. Well, if the top was the same and the rally to the 50-week was the same, are we going to see the same thing occur at the 50-week, sort of like a 4 to 6 weeks distribution phase, which seems like it could be playing out, followed by the final plunge into the depths of the Cryptoverse, where hopefully we get our Ethereum accumulation phase of a lifetime videos. We'll have to wait and find out. But hopefully you enjoyed this video. Leave a comment down below if you have any insight into Ethereum. Maybe you have something you want me to take a closer look at. But this is what I'm seeing. This is what I think we need to be aware of. This is the downside risk, of course, and you guys know we talk about the downside risk quite a bit just because you know how easy it is to get burned in crypto. A lot of lessons can be learned, I think, during phases like this, but all it takes is a few months of a phase like this to sort of forget all those lessons learned. And if something like this were to play out once again, you could sort of see the same those same lessons come back very quickly. And if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. We do have Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.